Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a $1 trillion, pound, euro, pick your currency, frankly, industry that showcases the very worst of human decision-making. That industry is fraud. It's one I've explored on the show before, but never through the lens that my guest offers up. She's Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope, and she's the Dr. Barry J. Epstein Endowed Professor of Forensic Accounting at DePaul University in Chicago, and she's a nationally recognized expert in risk forensic accounting and white-collar crime research. Kelly's recently published a book called Fool Me Once, which, in her words, explores what makes perpetrators tick, victims so gullible, and whistleblowers so morally righteous. And it's filled with a wide variety of stories that illustrate quite how common fraud is. What's also remarkable is that the book isn't just about other people. It forces the reader to consider their own behaviour because, as Kelly highlights, we're all capable of committing fraud. So whether you're in the business of preventing fraud or not, this is relevant to you. It's also highly fascinating. Before we begin, my usual reminder to you that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. You can find links to where you can read the first few chapters of that in the show notes. With that said, back to this episode, and it's one of those that really got me thinking, and I think it'll do exactly the same for you. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope on scams, stories, and secrets. Kelly, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, I am super excited to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll come on and talk about your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But before we do that, can you tell my listeners a little bit about how you came to be in your chosen field?
Well, I started taking accounting when I was in high school. So I've been in my chosen field. My field chose me before I chose it. I took my first accounting class when I was a ninth grader. And I realized then that I loved the understanding of money. And every organization has it. So you can't get away from needing a good accountant or needing somebody that understands the inflows and outflows of money. So I took my first class in ninth grade. In 10th grade, I kept taking accounting classes. And then in 11th grade, I took econ and realized, just don't like economics that much. But I respected it, but I didn't want to major in it. So when I went on to college, I majored in accounting and then got my master's in accounting and got my PhD in accounting and then became a CPA, certified public accountant. And, I never looked back because I realized the need. There was always a need. Like there's always a need for somebody who can explain money concepts to someone. So that's really how I started with just accounting. With forensic accounting and fraud, I remember when I was a professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, I had a student that wrote a research paper about the field of forensic accounting. And it was new to me. I knew of the traditional areas of accounting, so auditing, transactional services, taxation. But forensic accounting was this area that was like, wow, this sounds pretty interesting because it's like the combination of accounting, auditing, psychology, criminology with a dash of nosiness. And that was just like perfect for me. So I started I started doing interviews with people that had been touched by crime, whether that were the perpetrators, whether that were the victims or the whistleblowers, and just got fascinated with wanting to understand the decision-making process in various cases. And so I did all these interviews and created a documentary. My first documentary was called Crossing the Line, Ordinary People Committing Extraordinary Crimes. And then that led me to doing another documentary, which is more of a mainstream documentary called All the Queen's Horses. So that's sort of the journey. That's how I got here.
And I love it because when you, and I say this as an accountant, but I left the profession relatively quickly. I mean, I've retained the qualification, but I sort of moved that space because I I guess I was never particularly good with numbers or maths, and I think what's really interesting is the way you describe your path there is yeah, you can do all that stuff, but you're curious about what's driving those. It's the human behavior behind it. And it's a link
Sure.
that with hindsight is
Well,
obvious to me, but I never really made. And I'm fascinated but that you did.
oh, yeah. I mean, because you think about a number on a financial statement is that one point in time, there's a series of decisions, people, emotions, tons of behaviors. So I think sometimes we look at a financial document and we get so either intimidated or hate it, but we forget that there's a huge story behind how that one number got there. So I'm fascinated really by the story behind the numbers. And that's really what keeps me going because there's a series of decisions that were made. There were tons of meetings, there were people that got hired, fired because of a decision, and so it all landed into this one number, this one line item on an income statement or a balance sheet. And so the interesting part of our field really are understanding those stories around the numbers. And we don't really think about that a lot because I think the way our field is taught or maybe even embraced is very transactional. But there is lots of emotions that we're not talking about that result in just one number, one data point. So I want to bring the story out behind those data points.
And that brings us beautifully to the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And it reminded me, we see this on Netflix quite a lot. There's clearly a fascination with crime and wrongdoing and the human stories behind it and the impact. So we know that. And you beautifully took us on a journey that starts to explore, what is happening behind some of these stories and the human drivers on all sides of it. So I guess the first question is, so how did you pick the stories that you featured in the book? Because there's not a shortage of content out there, I guess, for this.
Well, the stories featured in the book really came from me wanting to break down these concepts differently. And so the book is organized in three chunks. So there's the first part is the perpetrators, the middle part is about victims, and the last part is about whistleblowers. And what I wanted to do is open the conversation up because I love anything true crime. I watch it, listen to it, can't get enough of it. But what I realize is a lot of those stories are so sensational and interesting, but they're really talking about intentional perpetrators because those are the people that knew they're inside an organization, they know the weaknesses, and they use those weaknesses to exploit those weaknesses for personal gain. And that personal gain is what makes a really great movie. They're going out buying cars, living lavishly, running from law enforcement, like all of that we just love. And what's interesting about it is so many of us don't identify personally with those characters. We like watching it. We like saying, "Oh, did you see what was on?" We like that part, but we don't see ourselves as that person. So I started thinking to myself, how can I open this category up so that more people actually see themselves as potentially could commit some type of crime. And so that's really where you have these two additional categories called accidental perpetrators and righteous perpetrators. And those are people that, well, the accidentals, let's start with them. Those are your people pleasers. Those are your team players. Those are the people that don't push back when their boss asks them to do something and that could land them into some serious trouble and could be a knock on the door from the SEC, the knock on the door from the FBI, or could result in federal prison. And so those situations you can identify with. You can identify with your whoever you report to, whether it's the C-suite, whether it's a director or manager, whoever that level above you is. If that person comes to you and says, "Hey, I just need you to sign off on this. Don't worry about the details. We'll explain it later. We'll fix it all later. Don't worry. I just need your help because it needs two signatures. Just sign it. Don't worry." And you do it because you trust that person. Well, that signature now documents that you were privy to whatever was going on. And we might not have read the fine print. And so those people also get mixed up into federal cases and go to prison. You can maybe identify with that. Then the righteous perpetrator, those are your stars, your halo. They have a halo effect in the company. They can do no wrong. They may be the highest sales earner. They may manage the biggest client for the firm. And so they bring status with them. And when they are around, you don't want to upset them. You keep them happy. Whatever they want, they get. So the rules don't always apply to them. And so sometimes those stars can do things that they want to help somebody. So they're doing it for good intentions, but they might be breaking some rules in order to do that. And so they may use their power and privilege within an organization to help somebody externally outside of that organization. So say you are a controller and you have oversight over loan approvals, let's say, and you have a friend who has a struggling startup and you believe in this startup. They just need some extra capital, but they don't have the cash flow to secure a loan at your bank. But if they had just a little bit more, they could secure this loan. And so you're going to help them. You're going to sort of pump it up so you help them because you know they're good for it. It's going to work. And they didn't receive any personal gain from that, but they helped somebody. Those kinds of two categories, those stories, they don't always make the papers. They don't always make the podcast about them because the sensational stories, that's what gets views and gets downloads and everything. But I wanted people to be able to see their role as a perpetrator, if ever. If you think about it, statistics show us that fraud is at this point about $5.2 trillion problem. That's not just because everybody's an intentional perpetrator. There's a huge population of people that are engaging in fraud. And that's just what we know. Just think about all that is not documented. So that's what I wanted to do on the perpetrator side. I could keep going on talking about the whistleblowers and victims, but I'll stop there.
We'll come on to those, but the real sense I had, and this is something that plays out in the work that I do and when the compliance people that I speak to, is that we all have this kind of narrative in our minds that crime and fraud it's committed by people that are deliberately setting out to do it, evil people, right? That sort of the fairy tale category, if you like, of. And I remember reading it, just thinking there are lots of scenarios in there where I thought I haven't quite been in exactly that scenario, but I've been in plenty of situations where it could have veered in that direction. And so it was a real case of reading it. It was there,
Sure.
but for the grace of God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and so I wanted to write the book in a way that allows a reader to have some self-reflection. I am an accounting professor, but this is not an academic book. It's a story-driven, character-driven book that's sort of like, that's sort of interesting how that happened. And you know what? I've been in a meeting where I've heard that happen. Like I see how that could happen to someone. And that's what I wanted to get under your skin a little bit. So when you finish it, you're like, I know what this is like because I've experienced it. So yeah, that was the goal of really just making sure I could explore and open people's minds up because all perpetrators, we're talking about them right now, are not stealing for greed. Not everybody does that. And I wanted people to understand that differently.
I'd say two things. Right? One is it's definitely not academic. You can just tell from the cover, which just screams the opposite of academic books, right? It's very beautiful, right? Very, very obvious standout in the bookstore, beautifully chosen color. But also, I think, as you say,
Thank
it's just a
you.
series of stories, and it's very, very readable by someone that you don't have to know anything about accounting, right? This is just for the average person to read, and I think it's interesting particularly
That's the goal.
well, you've succeeded, that's for sure. And then I was reflecting on two levels. One was there, but for the grace of God, go I, and the decisions I've made myself. But also, if I think about kind of compliance people or risk managers within organizations, this is something that they need to be thinking about in terms of their own decision making. Because again, that narrative of fraud is committed by bad people who are deliberately setting out to do bad things. Yeah, they do exist, but they're not the people that we're going to catch with, for example, a training program. Because bad people tend not to pay attention. The only thing they're paying attention to in training programs is to tick the box to say that they've been there so they can remain undercover. and or they're looking for loopholes.
Absolutely.
They're not trainable because they're not in that particular mindset. And so if we think about what's the key objective of things like training and communications, sure, there's an element of sending a signal to genuine bad people that there is some form of control there. But ultimately, they're going to go ahead and do this. What we're trying to get to in the vast majority of cases is people that can accidentally find themselves in circumstances where they commit fraud, either because the opportunity arises and they're not really thinking, or inadvertently. And so I thought it was really interesting for people that are in roles where they're trying to prevent this stuff from happening to reflect on the fact that the majority of people that you are speaking to when you're communicating, when you're engaging them, is not the hardcore criminals because they're not listening. It's the average employee. It could be anyone.
Absolutely. It's as you were talking, I was thinking about what's so important about being able to be a solid storyteller and good communicator is you need people to be able to see themselves in these situations in order for there to ever be a change. And so if you treat training as a check the box kind of, okay, I have to sign the code of conduct, or okay, these are the regulations according to these are the banking regulations that we have to follow, or if we're going to receive some funding from the government, then we have to do this, this, and this. If that's the way that your organization is embracing training, then you're not speaking to you or I. You need to show them the Andy Johnsons of the world, his case, where he was scared to push back. He was the internal accountant working in a very sales driven organization, the CEO, the CFO, the COO. Nobody wanted to hear about generally accepted accounting principles. They didn't want to hear that. They just wanted the numbers to work. And so the tone from the top was just make it work. And so people, when they hear that, everybody really wants to be liked. They want to be evaluated highly, and they want to be pleasing to people. So they're going to try to do their job. So I think that this scenario-based training, which I think the book is really giving you through these stories, is really what we need to do. And for your audience, compliance professionals, it's almost like if you just when people hear compliance, their ears close. When people hear accountants, their ears close. When people hear ethics, everybody thinks they're ethical. So there are these trigger words that we're using that really allow people to just say, "You're not talking to me." And so we got to get around that. And so I remember when I was thinking of a title for the book, I knew I wanted a phrase that a lot of people had heard. So that's sort of where the name, the "fool me once" came from, because it came "fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me." And then I wanted it to speak to people in a way that most things don't. And so there are just a number of changes I think that we can make, just minor tweaks, in order to speak to a larger population. But if it's rule-based, regulation-based training that we're doing, you're never going to get to the masses.
Right. And what I thought was interesting here was we know from Netflix and from lots of other contexts that stories are what engages people. And what I liked about what you'd done was that these were, in the nicest possible way, very ordinary stories, in the sense of, you haven't picked massively racy companies or things that are exceptional. These are everyday tales that I think really, really resonate
Mhm.
almost because of that precise thing. And so I thought it was just fascinating that this isn't something that's commonly understood in that space. You've gone out and said, let's pick things.
And these are probably the things that are happening every day in your companies, in your organizations. Like these, the expense reimbursement or credit card fraud or even time abuse. I mean, all of these things are happening every day. So let's talk about that. I was watching yesterday a really interesting presentation from an author named Jim Campbell, who wrote the book Madoff Talks.
Mhm.
And he did a session about Madoff. And what was interesting about it was how he talked about the clients that Madoff served and how all of them were just greedy clients. I mean, he looked at them as just greedy people. And if you ask any of them if they thought they were ethical people, they all would say they were. But what's interesting about when we talk about Madoff, I think Madoff, in his story, his case turns off so many people because that very few of us are wealthy enough to be considered a Madoff investor. So when he served a very niche market. His fraud was more, yes, it was a Ponzi scheme, but it was more about an affinity fraud because the group of people, his investors, were very homogeneous in their makeup. And I think that although we are, as a public, are shocked by the number and the amount of his fraud, when we start looking at the people, the victims, so many where people were like, they're rich anyway, who cares? So when you use those big, big cases, you turn off people because they don't see themselves as this ever happening to them. But when you use everyday common things that could happen to your personal life or in your corporate life, but on a lower scale, that resonates, in my opinion, very differently. I mean, Steven Spielberg was a Madoff victim. Steven Spielberg, do most of us, I mean, I'm a little filmmaker, but I'm not Spielberg. So, but I mean, do I really feel like Spielberg's life was negatively altered where he could not eat or get his medicine or pay his mortgage? No. And so I don't care in the same way as I care about some of these smaller cases. And that's why I really focused on those.
What's interesting when we look at the justice system as well, there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that it's always the little people that get punished, and sort of, you've got big fraudsters are perceived to tend to get away with things. And so I thought the other thing was interesting is when we tell these stories of the big cases, they're sort of seen as exceptional flagship, poster children or poster men and women for crime. But actually, that's not, as you say, one, I can't associate with it, but two, those are sort of exceptional things. The kinds of things that you're talking about, everyday events, we can associate more with them, but that's much more relevant to our own, the sorts of situations that we're likely to find ourselves in. That's much more common. And yet that doesn't make the training headlines. And so what I really liked was you pulled that out and thought, well, how do I engage an
Oh,
everyday audience for things that are going to be relevant, speak to them about stuff that they can, well, give them pause to think rather than I'm watching somebody else's life that isn't anything to do with mine.
well, and my documentary, All the Queen's Horses, one of my approaches with that was getting to a larger audience. So, just for context, All the Queen's Horses chronicles the largest municipal fraud that happened in the United States history. And this small town, population 16,000 people, called Dixon, Illinois, lost $53.7 million, and their city comptroller embezzled it over a 20-year period. Now, her name was Rita Crunwell. Now, she had a very simplistic fraud scheme, super simplistic. She opened up an account that no one knew about. She was the comptroller, so she could walk in a bank and do that. Opened up an account, disguised it that it looked like a city account by the name that it had. And all she did was move money from the legitimate accounts to the illegitimate accounts. That's it. Just moving money from one account to the next. And she did that 179 times. So there were 179 phony invoices that allowed her to steal $53.7 million. So these everyday simplistic schemes can result in big losses. So if we only focus on the big cases, we're missing a ton of fraud that is happening. And so what I thought was really interesting too during the pandemic, what you saw the US government doing was issuing PPP loans to help businesses to get money back in the hands of businesses because businesses are struggling because businesses need people. And if you can't go into a restaurant or if you can't have your employees come to work, then everyone's struggling. So, in order to help businesses, the PPP loans were, in a sense, putting money in the hands of entrepreneurs. And so, in order to expedite money getting into the hands of entrepreneurs, a lot of the rules, a lot of the internal controls were relaxed. So, what I mean by that is an entrepreneur could say I only had 4 employees, but because of the rules being relaxed, I might decide to say, well, I have 40 employees and my revenues are let's say $10 million. They may be $500,000 in reality, but there were no checks and balances. And so the PPP loan amounts were based on the number of employees that you would say. So all of this information was really self-reported. And what that did was made it a field day for people to engage in PPP loan fraud. You see it, you see the headlines now coming out where this person bought cars and went on lavish vacations. I was just at a cookout yesterday, and there was a makeup artist who was at the cookout. She said, "Oh, I know lots of people who took that PPP loan money and had tons of cosmetic surgery." And I said, "Are you serious?" She's like, "Oh, yeah. I can give you a name and addresses of at least 5 people." And these are entrepreneurs, everyday people who would never test the system in the way that they did, but they did. So you saw entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, chiropractors engaging in fraud to get this extra money. So many of us are doing these things, and someone needs to call somebody out on the smaller cases. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to focus on to make it um more approachable, make the fraud subject more approachable.
And so you've talked about the perpetrators. Take us through the other categories.
Sure. So in the middle section of the book, I talk about victims, and I talk about innocent bystanders and organizational targets. And innocent bystanders are about the individual, and organizational targets are exactly what they sound like, organizational targets like banks or the US government, or any government for that matter. And so the innocent bystander chapter is really looking at cases where we are just sort of sitting ducks. And you think about when you're drinking water, or you think about um when you are going to the pharmacy, when you get your medication from the pharmacist, you assume that it is what it says it is, and you have no way of verifying that it's not. Right? You assume when you go to the grocery store and you buy some organic strawberries, they're organic. You have no way of checking if they are or not. You get on an airplane, you assume that all the safety checks have happened and that plane is going to fly and land as it's supposed to. There's no way that you can check to make sure that it's not. So, in essence, we live a life of being these innocent bystanders, which really dovetails into the whistleblowing section, because this is why we need whistleblowers to speak up, because we are often just innocent bystanders. Organizational targets chapter is really about how organizations with predictable behavior often become targets. And it's one of the reasons why banks become such prime targets. Because if you think about the actions of a bank are very public and very known to many people. And I used to be on a show. I had just had one season, but it was a great show. It was on CNBC called Super Heist. And I was one of the subject matter experts. And so it chronicled these large bank heists. And what was interesting, I was on 4 of the 6 episodes. And what was interesting is the commonality between all of the heists, because the masterminds behind the heists all knew exactly every activity of the bank. When the armored truck would come, when they would leave, when the janitorial staff came, when they would leave, like all of their actions were known. And so the more you know, the more it's easy to be a target. So that's what that middle section is. The last chapter, or the last section of the book, are about whistleblowers. Now, as much as we need whistleblowers, most of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, don't like a whistleblower. We do not like the person that spills the beans, even if those beans are correct. We don't like the person that does that. And the question that I really want to push back with everyone is that fair? So you think about some of the situations when whistleblowers have proven to give us valuable information that we've needed, and we tolerate them, but we really should celebrate them more. So in the whistleblower section, I talk about 3 categories, and those categories are accidental whistleblowers, no noble whistleblowers, and vigilante whistleblowers. Now, when we think about whistleblowers, a lot of times people think of the words snitch, rat, tattletale, traitor, things that we don't really think are good qualities. But I argue that those titles go towards the vigilante category because vigilante whistleblowers, they are your employees or your team members that know the code of conduct inside and out. And when anybody gets out of line, they're telling. And so they're telling whether it has anything to do with them or not. They might be at the water cooler or at the copy machine and they overhear somebody talking about something unethical. They're like, I'm going to report them. That's your vigilante whistleblower. Now, you might not want your whole team like that, but they do have value. The accidental whistleblower is the person that just stumbles upon a fraud or some unethical decisions that someone's making, and they may not report immediately, but they report eventually. And then the noble whistleblower is the person that is in the midst of maybe an unethical team or an unethical decision, and they step out and report it. And when they do, they're attacked by everyone else. So all of these whistleblower categories have some variations to them, but we need them. And I think what fascinates me, maybe even more than the perpetrator category, is could I be that type of whistleblower? Because if you think about it, it's easier to stay quiet. Whistleblowing really serves to uplift the organization, but it's very detrimental to the person that's blowing the whistle. There's often not a lot of emotional positive gain there for them. It's easier to stay quiet. And so I think that I am mesmerized by the people that can take on those fights and fight to the end in the name of justice. And I don't know if I would always do that. I might just keep my head down or I might just leave, depending on what the situation is. But I wanted to give voice to the important role that they play in the fraud cycle.
And again, it's you're telling stories of people that are relatable. Yeah, this isn't unusual sets of circumstances. So again, it's continuing that theme of stories where we can sort of recognize elements that we would know, even if we don't work for that particular organization, but the behavioral dynamics are there. And I thought it was interesting that you dissected different types of whistleblower, because I think when we talk about it, in the same way that we do with perpetrators, there's a very simplistic analysis that goes on, which is kind of like, oh, whistleblowers, they're just one category. And what you've identified is that there's different reasons, sometimes determined by circumstance, but sometimes by the nature of the people, why people might want to whistleblow on the situation. And I thought it was fascinating to just go and to dissect that, because if I really want to facilitate this thing, I need to recognize that they're not all one type of person doing it for one type of reason in one type of circumstances. There's this totality, and it gave me real pause for thought about. I thought, the general point you were making around we need to encourage and incentivize it and support it was well taken. But I really liked the way you segmented it, because it gave me pause for thought around we tend to have a one size fits all approach to the way we talk about it, the way we encourage, incentivize, the way we facilitate or don't it. And I thought it was interesting that we really ought to start analyzing it in the way that you've outlined, because that's the human reality, the end of this. It's not just a theoretical thing, it's actual people taking real risk for particular reasons. And understanding that, I think, equips us much better if we're thinking about processes and structures to support that.
Well, and to your point, our reaction to people's rationalization as to why they whistleblow is very different. So think about this. An accidental whistleblower, somebody that is not setting out to look for something, just sort of stumbles upon it, didn't really mean to. We're a lot more accepting of them. Like they might be, I was just doing my job and I just found this. I didn't know what to do with it. I sat on it for a few days and then I let someone know. I wasn't looking. We feel more comforted by that person. Compared on the other end of the spectrum is the vigilante who is sitting like this every day, just waiting for anything. Anybody to step out of line, I'm ready for you. You break a rule, I am reporting you. That person we just can't tolerate. We're angered by them, but we need them too. And then the noble sort of fits in between. The tough part about the noble whistleblower is they are a function of groupthink. So if everybody thinks one way, and this one person steps out, the group's going to attack that person because you're not really allowed to think differently than the way we have decided to think as a group. It's almost like the other side of affinity fraud. When you think about why affinity fraud works so well, it's because everybody does everything else everybody else does. Because once you have one or two people in your affinity group that is in agreement with it, all the traditional due diligence that you would do goes out the door because you've been it's been co-signed by people in your group. Well, the same kind of dynamic exists with a noble whistleblower because when you are in a group, in a team, you're supposed to move as a unit, think as a unit. And if you step outside of that, it's really tough. That team is going to look at you like you're not one of us anymore. We're going to back far, far away from you. Even if you're right, we're still not going to support you because that's not what our team does. We all either say yes or we all say no. And if you're saying something different, we're not a fan of that. So I think our human reaction to the type of whistleblower really it matters because I think we're kinder to the accidental and just have a lot of hate towards the vigilante. So there's a spectrum of how we emotionally respond to those whistleblowers.
And I thought, as you were talking about that level of acceptance, that it sort of occurred to me as I was reading some of the stories that, given that, I mean, you could almost say, look, to ease the whistleblower's path, it might be better for them to have a particular narrative and therefore to think ahead, because actually, if there is a greater social acceptance of one type than another, then potentially framing your whistleblower to the extent that you can as one of the more acceptable ends of the spectrum could make your life easier.
Absolutely. I think it totally could. I think it's a hard narrative to frame, but if we could do it, if people would give you the 5 minutes to explain, maybe we would treat them differently. Now, I'll tell you this where this whole idea of thinking about whistleblower categories, really thinking about all the categories, really came from my experiences doing All the Queen's Horses and my experiences having offenders, victims, and whistleblowers speak in my graduate accounting class. Because what I started to notice was the behavioral shift my students had. And let me just tell you, I say students, but my graduate students are working professionals, and the age range is typically between 25 to 40. So these are not, 19, 18-year-olds that don't understand the way the world works. Most of them work professionally. Because I am in downtown Chicago, they have professional jobs. So, I wanted to give that context because sometimes when I say the word student, sometimes people are like, they're not real
Okay.
people. But these are actually real people. And so what I've observed is how they change. When a intentional perpetrator is sharing their story, the students are angry, But when a righteous perpetrator or an accidental perpetrator shares their story, they are empathetic. With whistleblowers, an accidental whistleblower, they're ready. They're open to accepting them. But let it be a vigilante whistleblower, and they're just like, "You're a snitch. You're a traitor. I don't really like you." Their analysis of them is very different. They start picking them apart. The light shines on what the flaws of the whistleblower is now, not necessarily the content of what they're saying, but they're looking at them as a person. So just observing their behaviors over the years is really what made me think this needs to be broken down a little bit differently. Then, with the documentary, Rita Crunwell was an intentional perpetrator, but the whistleblower, Kathy Swanson, was an accidental whistleblower. And so, seeing how people treated her, she was actually embraced. She was never um, harassed or demoted. She never had the traditional whistleblowing experience that you read about because it's a tough road for whistleblowers in general. But accidental whistleblowers tend to have an easier time. And so that's what I started just thinking about. Like all of these stories aren't the same, but yet we talk about them in the same way. Rita Crunwell, Bernie Madoff, Elizabeth Holmes, Andrew Fastow, all are different categories of perpetrators. They're not all the same. Those rationalizations as to why they did what they did are not the same. Now, granted, they are all still perpetrators. Well, something that I have to do one day, and I haven't done this yet, but I need to do this. I would love to do a study where I look at, let's say, 1,000 cases, and I classify them, whether they're an accidental perpetrator, a accidental perpetrator, intentional perpetrator, or a righteous perpetrator, and then make a list of the sentencing. So, because my anecdotal argument is, if you're an intentional perpetrator, the sentencing is higher. But if you are an accidental, your sentencing is a little bit lower. And then righteous falls somewhere in between. I'd love to empirically test that, because then I have a real solid theory. But that's what, just, anecdotally looking, back of the envelope, that's what I've started to notice, that if you're an intentional perpetrator, the book is going to be thrown at you. I mean, unless you have the money to pay for a top legal defense, the book is being thrown at you. Accidental, the judge may empathize more. Maybe. You might just get a year and a day in federal prison because you're not the mastermind behind it. You were sucked in. You should have known a little better. You should have spoken up, but you're not the mastermind. And then the righteous perpetrators, they can go either way because they are, it depends, because they're the stars. So, I'd love to be able to test that theory one day. And then maybe that'll be my next big study I'll do, because I need to figure out how to get all the data. But I would love to do that maybe one day.
And I love the way you talk about it. The level of enthusiasm and passion for the subject really comes through. You talk a lot in the book about your teaching and your students, and I think that categorization was very important. Another illustration of how perception matters, right? So the way the word student leads us to a particular conclusion, that helpful. You said, but you talked in the book, for example, about you invite people in to talk, but you also go on field trips. And I love the story in there where you basically just sprung on your students and said, "Who fancy coming on a field trip?" And off they go. Can you talk a little bit about that thinking? Because I think there's almost what you're not doing is just poring over numbers and reading witness statements. Is that there's a little bit of a sort of
No.
anthropological element to this, where you go out and see people and bring them in and really engage with I guess the actors and the witnesses to these things. Can you talk a little bit about that thinking? Because they just screamed out that you were really trying to get as close to these things as possible. And as I say, to the extent of taking your students out of the lecture theatre and in to go and do field trips.
Sure. So I have two kids. They're older now. But when I started really changing my approach as an educator was when my son, who's my oldest, was in kindergarten. And what I realized was his teacher, Mr. Vaccaro, had an ability to engage those 5 and 6-year-olds in a way that I needed to be using to engage college, undergraduates, graduate students, and executives. And I started to do some of the same techniques that he did in that kindergarten classroom. And that was rewards, stories, music, food, and field trips. So the only thing I didn't have to do, I just didn't need to get a parent's permission slip, because, these are adults. But one day I said, I, I am doing, I'm looking into a new case, and I did some work. It cost $80 for us to go full round trip. If we take a flight on Southwest, we can go to Minneapolis. We can meet this gentleman. I'll rent a large van, it was like what do they call it? Sprinter, I think, that seats a lot of people. And we will get on the plane. We'll leave at 5 a.m. We'll fly there. We'll get there in an hour. We'll get in the van, drive to his house. We'll do all day interview. Then we'll go to Mall of America, walk around, eat dinner, and get back on a flight at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. that night. And it's a big full day, but who wants to come? Half the class raised their hand. They're like, this is cool. But when
Right.
I tell you that it was just an amazing experience, even when I was filming All the Queen's Horses, I would bring students. I would send out an email and say, I'm filming today in Dixon, Illinois. Who wants to come? I have this amount of seats in my truck. If anybody wants to come, you're welcome to come and be on set and learn what we do. And, I've always taken them with me because I like it's not only a learning experience for me, but it's a learning experience for them. And it just makes it makes class fun. But I learned this from observing a kindergarten teacher, and it's so it's just so effective. So we had just a live forensic accounting class that day where they had to do the pre-read. So we would download all documents from Department of Justice. So they did like a profile. So I would make like these little packets. And so they'd have to go through their packet before they came. They prepare questions. I did my preliminary interview with this person was Nathan Mueller. And then they went and had their time to ask him questions. And it was just such a rewarding experience for them. So it's something that I wish I could do every year. We tend to go out in the field, so we'll go around Chicago. We'll go, or we'll have people come in because a lot of times when you have, especially convicted felons, they're still trying to get their lives back together. So they may not be able to, we may not be able to visit their home, but they'll come to class. And so, yeah, it just makes class, it's such a unique experience. And so I still get students that will write to me and say, I remember that as something that was really transformational in my learning process at DePaul. So yeah, something we do.
I loved it. It was just, it just made me smile as I was reading it because I just thought that's super cool way of engaging people. And you obviously talk to a lot of people as you've evidenced. Is there a sense either of perpetrators, but also I guess whistleblowers or the people want to offload a little bit because all of the things that you're talking about are traumatic experiences, I guess, for whatever you're involved. If you've been through the justice system, that's not going to be a pleasurable experience. If you've been a whistleblower, that's not necessarily a pleasurable experience. Is there a sense that people need to unburden some of this stuff, and that therefore fraud has a major impact, not just on the victims of it, the people who have lost money, but also anybody that's sort of peripherally involved in it. It seems to me there's quite a lot of unburdening that needs to go on.
Well, yes, and sort of, because what I found is the betrayal of fraud cases from journalists in the media sometimes is a little skewed, and because of word count and because of deadlines, there are some case details that tend to be left out that need to be known. There's context that's often missing. When it comes to a lot of the legal documents, I think the legal documents are outstanding documenting the facts. But sometimes what I need to know are the emotions and the decision behind the facts. And so, to some degree, there's unloading, but there's also a level of correction. Let me give you why this happened. And I find that to be very helpful because it provides the context that you don't have when you're just reading the facts. Now, does that impact the sentence of the person? Probably not, but it impacts our empathy and our ability to help or judge. And when you think about how, at least in the United States, how the criminal justice system works. You're guilty until proven guilty. And even after you served your time, you're guilty for the rest of your life. And so, getting around and trying to get reestablished in a career in society is tough. We are not forgiving as we think we are. So perhaps people having the ability to share their side of the story may help with our empathy and helping them reacclimate themselves into society. And, I may be more biased now because when I do interviews with offenders and really whistleblowers have a hard time too. So what's interesting is the parallels between those lives. One has a felony charge and the other doesn't. But the one that doesn't have the felony charge, it's sometimes hard, just as hard for them to find a job as it is for an offender because trust has been violated with the whistleblower in terms of the group that they're trying to get involved back in. And then the felony charge makes it difficult for the offender. But I think that giving them the opportunity to help people understand what happened is so important. And we're only seeing it when we're watching shows about intentional perpetrators. But we need these other shows as to, okay, why would an accountant get mixed up in this? Maybe their bosses were so aggressive and they could not speak up, or, you want to understand the why. So sometimes we just need more than just the facts.
I love that. Fascinating. We talked a little bit about the middle section of the book, and it struck me that as you were talking about how these things happen, the environments and the organizations, you talked about banks as an obvious target. I mean, it struck me that in the way that we run society nowadays, and I'm talking as a function of technology, the complexity of the world, there are certain key dynamics there that we, as you say, we have to trust people, right? I can't verify every single aspect of my existence because I'd never get anything done, and often the opportunity to verify doesn't exist. So what you're painting a picture of, I guess, is that fraud is a natural consequence of the society that we're in. And I'm guessing you'll probably also say it's a natural consequence of human behavior as well. But it seems to me it's there because of human behavior. It's there because of the structures we have, and this isn't going to get any easier.
No, it's not. It's not going to get easier because I think that two things. People are extremely busy and we put an undue amount of pressure on people. We expect only positive news. We expect results to always be this way and, up, increasing. And so those two things together make people feel like their back is against the wall and I have to figure out something and I can fix it later. We also are victims of optimism bias, where we think things are never going to be as bad as they are. And we have to remind ourselves, oh, they can get bad. And so, it there's a couple of things about human behavior, I think, that make the potential of fraud always at the surface. And some of the times we don't even realize what we're doing to create it. So if you are busy and you are a busy executive and you have your accountant or anybody that your direct report that comes to you and says, I need to talk to you about something. And the response is, walk with me. I'm busy. I have 5 minutes. Just tell me what's going on. You've already said that you're too busy to hear what they have to say. So you've already sort of shut down and put up a barrier. So, we have to realize some of the trigger things that we're doing that can help make fraud thrive in some atmospheres. And so I think that we are at a very interesting time in society where we only report good news. We want everything yesterday, and we don't have the time to wait for the results that we sometimes need. And that's the breeding ground for fraud.
And I mean, it just seemed to me as you were talking there, right? Is if I looked at tech, I've got instant gratification in terms of digital products they deliver, but also Amazon will get stuff to me quicker than it's ever been possible before. I've got social media that sort of leads to us presenting a stylized view of the world, not to mention polarization, all the other things that are there. But it seemed to me that tech really isn't helping in a lot of these things. And I guess tech is also a driver of fraud as well, right? Just as a pure opportunities to commit it.
Yeah, I think when we talk about tech, what we also, to add to your list, is we have instant competition. So you think about the people that you follow, they tend to be in different categories, but you might follow the celebrities that you never will attain where they are. But then you follow your friends. And when you see your friends vacationing in Honolulu or in Fiji, or they're like you, why don't you have what they have? Those things sort of get in you because you think about what tech has done, or specifically what social media has done, is it has leveled a playing field that probably isn't level. So, should I, Kelly Pope, be shopping at the same stores that Beyonce shops in? Probably not. Should I be going to the same restaurants that Beyonce's going to? Probably not. But yet I have access to it. And I feel as though we're on the same playing field and we're not. And so I think that does something to our psychology where we think I should have everything that this person or that person has because we are on the same plane. And we're really not because, scale is different, income is different. but I want it now. And so I think tech via social media has done its job on fraud, people's willingness to engage in it for sure.
And one of the other things that, as you were talking there around perception of things is I wondered also in economically challenging times, what I might sort of loosely term Robin Hood logic of is there something in the current economic climate where there's a greater opportunity to justify things, particularly for people that have fallen on hard times? Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, the Robin Hood syndrome is real because I think that social activism has always been a fabric or a variable in our culture. But I think over the past 5 to 8 years, it's become far more of a movement. Like we go through these waves of where it's a big thing and then it sort of quiets down and then it gets bigger and then it quiets down. But I think that we are in a point in life where the inequalities are so extreme that people don't they're willing to engage because I think of the inequalities. I just finished working on a study with the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, and it was one of the takeaways that I found very interesting was we found that insurers below the age of 45 didn't really think insurance fraud was wrong and actually felt like when others engage in insurance fraud, they feel anger that they didn't get to do it too. And so what that showed to me was people's fraud appetite is very huge. It's very large, because if there's a way for you to get over, you're going to get over because you feel like the multi-million, multi-billion dollar insurance or trillion-dollar insurance industry, they don't need any money. They're denying my claims. But so if I can get through and break through, I'm going to do it. So I think that the inequality in our country has allowed us to think that it is okay to cut corners. I also think when we have political leaders that may not be on the outside, their outside persona isn't one that is ethical, or they cut corners, that just bleeds down into the nature of our society. And so all of that makes it hard to combat fraud.
Yeah, I was thinking lots of characters come to mind, and not just in the US when you talk about that dynamic. And I guess a key component of this is lying. Because to commit fraud on some level, there'll be a lie involved at some point. And so really that core dynamic of honesty that's coming under a lot of pressure now, I guess is sort of, it's illustrative of the challenge.
Yeah, lying's a big part of it, but, let's also be clear, everybody's lying all the time. Some lies will get you in jail, some lies will send you to jail, some lies won't. But, it's a part of what we do, and sometimes we're lying to protect feelings, but it's something that happens. What's interesting about when you see lying in the corporate sector is sometimes those lies are not necessary. Like telling your spouse that you look great in a dress when you actually don't, just to preserve their feelings, is very different than saying that you have $4 million in revenue and you actually have a $7 million loss. Like, they're very different types of lies. But I think that there's tons of corporate lies that happen all the time, and so this is why I think understanding financial documents and unraveling the story behind that one number is so important because you start learning the behaviors, the decisions, the people, who's involved, what rank are they, why would they do this? Like you start learning the story behind it, which I think is the most fascinating
And
part.
final question, which just prompted by what you just said. There's an implicit presumption that fraud is always a bad thing. Are there any circumstances where it's justified? I mean, it's sort of in the back of my mind, I was thinking maybe, I don't know, sabotage for a greater moral cause or something. Is that something you've looked at or thought about, or is it just so obviously a bad thing?
I think I've never looked at it, but I would have to say that I don't know if I feel like deception is ever positive. Um, I'm sure if I think long enough, um, I can think of a reason why. Like if you're deceiving to get yourself out of harm's way, that's different. But in the corporate sense, in the financial sense, I'm not sure if there's ever a reason why we need it. But I've never studied that. Positive
Right.
deception, like that's what I'll call it.
I
I've never
love that.
studied that.
Maybe there's a book in that some later stage.
Maybe that would be funny though. That would be a funny book. The title would be Positive Deception. If you can think of all the reasons why these cases, this is a good example of deception. That would probably be a funny book.
Well, we'll look forward to reading that. I know in the meantime, you've got a ton of stuff to be looking at. You've already given us a sense of where your research is going. I'll get you to mention the name of the book and the publisher in a second, but I just wanted to say it was an absolutely fabulous read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found myself going back and really reflecting on my own behavior. And I think one of the biggest compliments I can pay any author is that my brain comes to a screeching halt and I think about what's there. And it took a lot of looking in the mirror to, there's certain situations. I don't think I've done anything along the lines of what's in the book, but I certainly found myself doing there. So I think it's the biggest compliment I can pay you that you really sort of caused me to think and challenge myself, which I think was the objective of the book. So tons of reasons why people should read this, both for professional and personal reasons. So with that in mind, tell them what the book is called and who it's published by.
Sure, the book is called Fool Me Once: Scam Stories and Secrets from the Trillion-Dollar Fraud Industry, published by Harvard Business Review Press.
Amazing. And if you're wandering through a bookstore, it's incredibly easy to find because it's got this very bright green cover. So you cannot miss it. Comes highly recommended from me. And as people will have detected on the in the conversation, Kelly, super engaging. You have a really, really just amazing sense of an ability to engage people. And we've heard some of the reasons why that is. So thank you for the work that you do, the book that you've written. But above all, thank you so much for being a great guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was tons of fun.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Kelly for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Kelly, her book, Fool Me Once, and the work that she does, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do on whichever platform you listen to the show on. It really, really helps. A reminder that you can read sample chapters from my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance. There's a link to that in the show notes. And you can find details of the show at humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that fraud is all around us, and frankly, we're all capable of it. And thank you so much for listening.